Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Mans, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition Show. This is the February 6, 2023 edition of the show. It is week 430. It has been 439 weeks since the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital. The April 4th Coalition's mission statement is, we are for workers' rights and collective bargaining rights and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is our custom, we put the emphasis on Article 23 at the start of the show.
I'll do the first two then.
Okay.
Number one, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. Number two, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number three, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself or herself and his or her family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented if necessary by other means of social protection. Number four, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of her or his interests. And as usual, we give a great thank you to Michael Putnam, who is the Community Radio Program Director, for airing our shows on Fridays at 6 p.m. And the call tag number for the community radio is WMNB LP 107.1. And we thank David Fabiano for helping us produce this show. And I want to thank Dick for covering for me last week. As everyone can hear, I'm still a little nasally, and I am going to be sucking on a cough drop throughout the show to try to keep the cough under control this time.
Well, thank you for being here. It's really hard to do this show without you, and
Thank you, Dick.
Yeah. I really
Well, at
appreciate
least I
you
came
being
back
here.
on a very good show, because
Yeah.
this is beginning of February, and it is Black History Month.
Right, and what we were going to do is show, I think there's 4 videos, but the first one we were going to show was Robert Reich. He has a suggestion about traffic stops, and why don't we watch that, and then we can react to it.
Okay.
Police have killed over 600 people during traffic stops in the last 5 years, with black drivers disproportionately falling victim to these deadly encounters. This is not public safety, and it doesn't have to be this way. Police officers with guns and tasers should be removed from low-level traffic enforcement immediately. Do we really need them issuing traffic tickets? Some cities, like Los Angeles and Philadelphia, have introduced laws and policy changes aiming to drastically reduce the number of pullovers for minor traffic offenses, which too often result in unnecessary escalation and deadly violence. Tyree Nichols is remembered as a kind, joyful 29-year-old with a love of family and skateboarding and a passion for photography. His senseless killing at the hands of Memphis police is yet another tragic example of a traffic stop turned deadly. He should still be alive, along with Daunte Wright, Philandro Castile, Walter Scott, Sam DuBose, and too many black Americans to name who've been killed by police following a traffic stop for something as meaningless as a broken taillight, an expired license tag, or an air freshener hanging from a rearview mirror. All of our communities should take note and work to end police involvement in traffic stops for good.
Yeah, definitely in this era, it's not necessary because you have all those cameras around and photo videos. So all you have to do, the police could take a picture of the license plate or a picture of the tail light out, and then just have the citation sent. You know,
Right.
It's how the state of Massachusetts gets the tolls.
Right.
You're driving through, they take a picture of your license plate, and if you don't have Easy Pass, they send you the bill.
Right.
Once you're done with the journey.
It just
so.
seems like it's been such a dangerous situation. It seems like that driving while black
Is definitely dangerous.
definitely an issue where others, might
Oh,
not
yeah.
be pulled over for the same thing. So I think that,
Right, unless that what they're doing is endangering another driver, I see no reason for the police to get involved at that level, just to stop and say, hey, your traffic light is out. Or all they have to do is stop and say, hey, did you know your brake light is out?
Yeah,
But you don't have to go further than that. You don't have to.
right. But this individual, Tyreen Nichols, I didn't watch the video, I have to admit. I can't watch violence like that. It really upsets me.
Oh, I did.
I didn't watch it, but, you know, I was told, according to Michael Moore, I listened to his podcast, and I encourage you to listen to Rumble. He just put one out Sunday. You can go on the internet or a podcast and listen to Rumble, and he spends an hour talking about this. And,
Oh, yeah.
and he said that he wasn't asked for license registry. He was just pulled out of the car.
Correct.
It was never,
He
he didn't know what he did wrong. And he was,
Right, and he asked what he did wrong.
Right, and he was given
And that's
all-
when they actually started being even more violent,
Yeah.
because he had the nerve to ask.
Yeah, so you
what he did
watched
wrong.
it. I'll let you say what you want to say.
Yes, I
but-
watched, and it was absolutely one of the worst displays of being. The hard part is, there was the first time when he was hauled out for the traffic stop, and they were just roughing him up against the car a little bit, and he got away because he felt he was in danger of losing his life. He ran away. And they sent other police officers to go looking for him, because saying he was a felon fleeing a crime, when all he had done was flee to save his life. And, you know, I don't know how I would survive in a situation where they tell you don't flee because they're going to beat on you. Well, they beat on
He
him.
was only 140 pounds, I heard.
He was, and there were 4 of them, 4 or 5 officers who took turns beating on him in that video.
And there were other officers around there, too,
Around
watching.
who did absolutely nothing to interfere
Yeah,
with it.
so-
And that is unacceptable under any terms. And I don't buy if you're an elite police force or anything else, which is, I think, is a distraction at all times.
Right.
Any irregular police officers have done
I
this.
think those elite police forces they're just to make our presence known
Right.
in the community.
And stuff. And law enforcement doesn't have to be that. And how can you trust law enforcement under those conditions?
Yeah, and we don't need that. And, you know, I've been reading this book, Black Earth, by Timothy Snyder, and he talks about the Holocaust and the history and warnings. And he talks about how people were treated not as citizens, you know,
Not
treated
even as human beings.
right,
to be honest.
not as citizens, not as human beings, and that's a very dangerous thing. So we have a few more videos that I wanted to show. They're not
Okay.
about police stops, though. There's one it's about critical race theory, because I've heard a lot of politicians talking about it. I hear them talking about wokeness, and that wokeness, it doesn't mean anything to me. The only thing I can do in my studying of Buddhism, they talk about awakening, becoming awakened, you know, and I think that woke and awaken,
I think that's the idea. is
the
to bubble
awakening
it up.
is lifting people's consciousness so you have a better view of the world and look at every living thing that has dignity. Every living thing has
Value.
God within
Yes.
them, you know. But anyways, this critical race theory, that I think we should get to understand it. So we have PBS, we have a little clip from PBS, and then we have a clip from the Washington Post. I think we're going to show that last. And then we have one from Now This, and that would be the second one. And they all talk about critical race theory. So why don't we watch those 3 right in a row, and then we'll talk about it after.
Let's just start with a basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other, that there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. That's a theoretical framework. I think what we're talking about today, though, is some contestation and conflict over how you teach about race, racial hierarchies, critically, racism in schools and society. And so the two are being conflated.
And so when you hear people talking repeatedly about critical race theory, what is your thought?
Well, I hear people talking about critical race theory. I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society. So, you know, there are a number of, I read a really good article just yesterday in the New Yorker about the origins of this conflict and who's behind it. And it's a concerted effort by many on the right to mitigate the extent to which we really augment and increase the understanding of racism in our society.
It's inconceivable that a white teacher would be teaching white children that they are evil because they're white. But that's what people think, even though it's blatantly false.
And I don't know if some of you guys have seen this critical race theory. It's basically teaching kids to hate our country and to hate each other based on race.
Critical race theory is an intellectual sort of field that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s among legal scholars and lawyers who were recognizing that racial disparity was persisting despite the public pronouncements that all these laws on the books were race neutral. And so these scholars recognized that something was wrong here and that they had to take a new critical approach to examining the law, to examining policies, to examining structures which they recognized were the source of these continuing disparities and not what's wrong with people.
And what are some misconceptions around critical race theory?
Oh, there are many. That critical race theorists argue that white people are inherently evil. That's not true. That critical race theorists argue that everything and everyone is racist. That's not true. Critical race theorists would be the first to say there are people battling and challenging racism. And then those are the people we should learn from. That people imagine that critical race theory is widely taught in schools. It's not even widely necessarily taught in law schools where it originated, where people want it to be taught, let alone in elementary schools. Another misnomer about critical race theory or even anti-racism is that it's anti-white or racist. And I don't think people realize that that is one of the oldest and most vile white supremacist talking points.
Teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer money.
Critical race theory is not appropriate for our kids to learn and to have in our school systems.
I think critical race theory is wrong, and I don't think it should be taught in schools at all, and I don't think we should fund any money to allow that to happen.
think of racial inequality in this country, I think it's important for us to recognize that historically, we've been arguing over why that inequality exists. And the racist position has stated the inequality exists because there's something inferior or superior about different racial groups, whether culturally, behaviorally, genetically. And the anti-racist position has largely stated that inequality is the result of policy and racist policy. So therefore, the problem isn't bad people, the problem is bad policy. And it's important, if we want to eliminate inequality, to identify those bad policies and replace them with the types of policies that can create equity and justice for all. Part of the challenge with discussing race and racism is people who argue racism no longer exists have one definition of racism that I've been trying to pin down for a while. They refuse to actually define it. And those of us who are documenting its persistence have a different definition. So fundamentally, in many ways, we're arguing over definitions. And so when I ever engage with people, in a constructive sense, to really get them to understand race and racism, the first and most important step is definitions. That's why How to Be an Anti-Racist is based and built and grounded in definitions, in defining terms. And these aren't defining terms out of sort of thin air. We should be defining terms based on the evidence, based on scholarship, based on history, based on material reality.
The whole purpose of critical race theory is to provide Americans with a way to understand the legacy of racism, even though those stories sometimes hurt.
It's anti-American training that vilifies white people and demands they apologize.
The best learning for students about social studies and about our democracy and our country is the learning where students can really grapple with the issues and really come to a deeper understanding of how our past informs our present.
All of this revisionist, woke curriculum, you are not going to do this to our children.
Teachers across the country are caught in the middle of the latest flashpoint in America's culture war, critical race theory. So what exactly is it? And why is there a push to ban it in schools?
Critical race theory is a body of ideas and a set of approaches to understanding the history and the present of American society that looks at the ways in which racial unfairness have been woven into the fabric of our institutions.
In other words, critical race theory, or CRT for short, is a legal academic framework centered on the idea that racism is systemic. It first started to coalesce in the 1970s, when Black, Hispanic, and Asian legal scholars were researching the persistence of inequality, despite the landmark legal victories of the Civil Rights era.
The legal scholars undertook a set of analyses and investigations that were aimed at trying to make sense of the puzzling persistence of racism in our legal system, in our political system, in our economy.
CRT has been studied in fields like sociology, economics, and political science. It's been used to examine issues such as housing and educational segregation, unconscious bias, and criminal justice reform.
Contrary to what often critics portray as sort of judging people intrinsically as being racist or not, or holding people responsible for, slavery in the past, it is actually to open up a conversation of how we all inherit and live in a society sort of beyond our choosing, right? We didn't choose where we were born or what racial group we were part of, and yet we have this common history. How do we understand that history? What does it mean for us? Those are the sorts of questions that critical race theorists were trying to grapple with.
The racial reckoning spurred by the police killing of George Floyd brought the decades-old framework back into the spotlight, as some schools sought to implement reforms that better address race in classrooms.
I think the thing that critical race theory would add to that conversation is that we not sort of confine that horrific example to Derek Chauvin, but to think about how, well, there were other law enforcement officers present, including officers of color, who stood idly by. And so that pushes us to think about, this phenomenon as not simply one of, racism by whites against blacks, right? I mean, it makes us think more critically, more engaged, more seriously around, well, why do these practices happen?
The push against CRT gained steam under former President Trump, when he directed federal agencies to end any diversity trainings related to critical race theory. Though ultimately blocked on First Amendment grounds and rescinded by President Biden, the fight over CRT at the state level is still in full effect.
The focus on CRT is a way to latch onto a concept that very few people sort of really understand, which sounds kind of scary perhaps to someone not, trained in what it means, and latch onto that as a kind of football in this sort of ongoing fight over, the future of this country with regard to racism.
As of mid-June 2021, 21 states have introduced bills attempting to restrict the teaching of critical race theory and or impose limits on how race is discussed inside the classroom. And those limits are often vague.
And instructors, educators, especially at the K-12 level, will just not go there, will not run the risk of upsetting parents or, being misunderstood or drawing the ire of, lawmakers.
In Texas, for instance, House Bill 3979 says teachers must explore current events from multiple positions without giving, quote, deference to any one perspective.
There's language in this bill, like teachers need to present a balanced perspective on current events, for instance. They have to do their due diligence to present multiple viewpoints. But what happens if they're talking about an issue in the classroom and they try to present multiple viewpoints, but the student comes home and tells their parent about the lesson that day, and the parent thinks, well, they didn't do a good enough job of presenting this viewpoint. So who decides when the teacher has done an adequate job of presenting multiple perspectives on an issue? It saddens me and disappoints me that instead of really embracing this opportunity to confront our nation's past and to tell authentic and more accurate narratives about experiences of diverse people in this country, that we're looking to sweep it under the rug. We're looking to erase it even further from our memories.
Lot to unpack out of all that.
Pardon? Yeah, there is.
There is a lot to unpack, and you don't think about it. I mean, from the political perspective, I get it. It's an uncomfortable topic, and they're not dealing with the actual critical race theory. They just found something that sounded good to use to push their point of view.
To scare people. It's a scare tactic.
With.
Now,
and I always reject anybody who tries to appeal to my emotions to get me to go along with something. But most people don't stop and think, this sounds scary, so therefore I don't want it.
Right.
On the other side, I can't go there. my head won't let me get there. That from the African American point of view, they're hearing an entirely different thing. They're hearing, you're down here and we don't want you up here. I think. Right.
I can remember. I grew up. I was born in the 1950s and grew up in the 1960s. I was in college in the 1970s. I took an economics course on microeconomics, and we had to do an end-of-year project, one paper we had to write on one economic issue. And so I tried to find the paper before I came in here, but I don't have it. But I did it on the dynamics of white racism in our economy. And it was very startling because, this was 1975, I believe, or 1974, 1975. And what I did was at the University of Massachusetts, they had all the census bound, and so I could go to the census and I would look at the census figures and I would I used graphs and was looking at wage. Someone, say if they were white and they had a college education, their average income was here. If they were black with a college education, their income was equal to a white with a high school education. I kept going through, it was, about child poverty. You can go and you can read those numbers, and you see that there was definitely
a pattern
of institutional racism, not individual racism. I remember Dick Gregory saying it, the Constitution gives you the right to believe whatever you want to believe. I mean, it's as much as it's awful, but it's the stinking institutional racism that really hurts people, right? When, like, he always used the example, say my father fought in World War II, Dick Gregory was black. He said, my father went over in World War II and fought against Germany, came back to the United States, moved, and wanted to buy a house in a white neighborhood, but he couldn't. But the same German that fought against him in World War II could have immigrated to the United States and bought a house in a neighborhood where his father couldn't.
Right.
There was just that institutional redlining, and so without studying the history of our country, the fact that people were enslaved, and the economic boon that brought to our country enabled us to build this society, and the fact that we wiped out an entire
indigenous
population, so much so that there's hardly any remnants of them,
and we're trying to forget that they exist as well.
Right, and is that something that shouldn't be taught in school? I mean, during Columbus Day, we talked a lot about what Columbus did when he came to America and the racist things that he did. Is that something that our children shouldn't learn about?
No, I think everybody should know about it, because how else can you progress beyond it or realize the pattern is repeating itself if you don't? And it doesn't mean that a white person is racist or being told that you're bad or evil. It means we are teaching you a history of acts that were done to create the country, and I'm sure they saw it as an economic thing, not anything else.
They were not treated as human beings.
They were not treated.
They were dehumanized, just like in the car stop when Tyree Nichols was killed at that car stop. He was not treated as a human being.
No,
he lost his dignity, and so we have to work hard to make sure that everybody in our society, if you want to fight crime, maybe let's put people to work, giving jobs
give
that
them
pay a
dignity.
decent wage, make sure that no children live in poverty. Let's take care of it on the front end, because if you can take care and feed children when they're young, the studies have shown that they succeed.
Do better.
Succeed. Educate them, equal opportunity education, early childhood education. All those things, you just don't pick on critical race theory.
No, that's
you got to provide
for people. That's an excuse to divert you away from focusing on what needs to be done to fix things.
Right.
And all that stuff. And we have about 17 seconds left, Dick. You have anything you want to tie up with?
No, I just want to say power to the people, and just keep studying.
Keep educating yourself.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way you know what's going on.
We have to, we can't be afraid of education. We have to look toward it.
See you next week.
There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in our union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Of the bosses we must pay for, from the cities and the farmlands to trenches.